what we're trying to do today, it's a second part of the series. So the first series, we had Yvette Nolan, who we all know, she's a mentor of mine, one of my mentors, and deeply appreciate the work that she's done in community and the country. And we also had Sarah Stanley, who some of us might know, and they were really bringing the question around, they specifically look at Massey report, and they were really kind of doing an historical survey of how did we start it and where are we now? And they were looking at that intentionally, and we have a video of that. Happy to share that once the edit, the edit is ready. And so we're thinking we want to stretch that further, because a lot of the time when we talk about policy, it can be very jargony, like I said, and many times it's like it's handed down to us. What will it mean if artists come together to engage and say, how can we explore an equitable cultural policy? What does that even mean, right? Especially within where we find ourselves, within post-Massey report, that was instrumental to creating Canada Council for the Arts. And I know all these things are very specific and they're all over the place, a lot of reports and all that. Well, I'm gonna bore you with that. And so we thought, let's have an opportunity to really engage with artists and those that are, from cultural planner to an artist to managers that have worked in multiple spaces, and say, can we get multiple perspectives, or what some other scholars would say pluriverse, like multi or diverse perspective about the kind of policy that we have right now, and how can that help us? So we have three panelists today. We have Kenji, and Kenji is going to introduce himself. All of them are going to introduce themselves, because also part of their positionality. We have Jasmindra, and then we have Rebecca. And then the three of them, we've given them, and I have to, this is where I check my notes. Yeah, that was good. I didn't even check my notes. That's good. There is a sort of a guiding prompt that we've given them. And we said, from your experience, how do the existing cultural policies support or not support your work? And what does an equitable cultural policy look like for you? So we give them that prompt and say, just run with it. So each of them will be doing a short 10-minute presentation. And then after that, we open things up to conversation, to questions. So for those on Zoom, we have the Q&A session. Please type in your question. We're going to get it here. We'll read it out loud. And for those in the room, we have a microphone to pass around if you have any questions. And without further ado, I'll invite Rebecca to take the stage.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Well, I was impressed at how long you spoke without a note. You were laughing about sort of how many notes we brought, but the idea of a 10-minute talk is somewhat daunting, especially when we think about cultural policy. So I am currently I'm the Director of Engagement Programs and Partnerships at Pacific Opera Victoria, which is my very fancy way of saying I work in community development and artist development. But I'm also an opera singer with an active practice. I create my own theater work. I'm a creative living coach, and I'm developing program work to help artists decolonize their understanding of performance through authentic storytelling. I'm a writer and a podcaster. Isn't everyone a podcaster now? Everyone's a podcaster. I'm also originally from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory and Williams Treaty Territory in Ontario. I'm Métis on my father's mother's side, and a mix of European, German, English, and French. And I'm very grateful to be speaking to you today from Aquanic Territory. So this question, how do existing cultural policies support or not your work? So let's start with positive. It's always good to start with the positives. I would actually say that they don't support my work often so much as direct my work. So working inside of a rather large arts institution, which opera companies always are, the funding and those policies really direct what we are able to pay for and what we are able to present to the public. So I would say in the last few years, even before the pandemic, certainly reconciliation was a prime policy driver, and that actually created quite a lot of funding opportunities. So that meant that we produced an opera called Missing, about murdered and missing Indigenous women, and also The Flight of the Hummingbird, working with a Haida artist, Michael Nicoyagalanis, and taking his story and developing it into an opera that could go to schools for children. So we can see that obviously when you're trying to put funding in place to develop work, these policies determine in many ways what we see as feasible. It can also be something that facilitates something that we already want to do. And my example for that would be the BIPOC leadership program that's run through the Belfry and with several partners. Pacific offers a partner in this. And we have talked about this. How do we diversify our office staff? Knowing that in the arts, probably true in most businesses, we just tend to hire the people we already know and trust. So how do we move into spaces where we just don't know people? We get very siloed. And so that program really opened up a world for us of being able to bring younger artists who want to work in administration into our office space in a way that we could never have accessed them, I don't think. I think it helps administrators like myself make movements inside of the company for things I care about. Obviously, as a Métis person, I care a great deal about my Indigenous community. There are things I want to do inside my community work specifically for Indigenous communities here locally. And that can be a difficult thing inside of an arts organization whose mission statement is, right, is to create beautiful art. That's basically at the heart of what we do at the company. And it will not always hold community service work in a way that lifts it up. And so I would say that the shifts lately in cultural policy has really driven more attention over to me. So instead of, I would say in the past that if you worked in community engagement, it was basically covert marketing. So it would be the talk before the opera, it would be a recital we would share with people. And I would sort of compare it to the Monty Python reference of Mr. Creosote who eats the last wafer thin mint and then explodes. I sort of feel like I'm feeding the same people. The people who already love the product, already get most of what society has to offer and support. And that was what my sort of role was when I started. And so the conversation we began to have is, if we want to actually be a good member of community, and if we want to serve in a meaningful way, then we need to move beyond those people. And that's a difficult thing to convince a board of directors of in an opera company, right? Because they really are there for the art. So I would say that the policy change has really moved my work up into the forefront for the company. It's made it be seen as something very valuable. It's helped our board of directors understand the importance of this work, that it is a part of art making is to be in relationship to communities. So I think that's been pretty powerful, and we have moved pre-show chats into marketing. So I'm pretty excited about that. What else do I want to say about this? I think particularly during the pandemic, we really benefited from the understanding in policymaking that artists were workers that contributed to society in a meaningful way. And I think there was a real highlighting, we will know in the arts, that we began to understand that we have put those people into freelance jobs that have no safety net. And I know, having been a freelancer up until 5 years ago, there's no unemployment insurance for me. I mean, welfare was my only choice, right? There's no maternity leave for me. So when we hit the pandemic, we started to see artists wanting to leave the field because there was no work for them. And the idea of being a portfolio artist was really born, and programs from Canadian Heritage began to support funding to help artists diversify skill sets, which I don't really see so much as I couldn't make it as a singer, and so I had to diversify my skill set. I really think it's that artists are very compassionate, interesting, productive people who have a number of passions, and art making is one of them, but many people are driven to many different ways of expressing themselves. And certainly right now, many artists have stories they wish to tell in opera about their community without having to go through an opera company and create a work separately. So the idea of recital-driven work that actually gives them the skill to self-produce, which is something opera singers never get and theater artists do, but we're trying to change that. I would say that money from Canadian Heritage was a real game changer for us in helping the company understand that we have a responsibility to artists. So we can't just bring them in for the 4 weeks we want them and then say, see you next year or see you in 2 years. That it was important for us to find ways to keep them engaged with us all the way through, whether or not they were performing for us. So I think that's how policy is serving, certainly my work and serving the work of the company, because it really does direct us and help us bring to the forefront things that we would like to see move, and it helps our board understand the importance of it. And then we get into the list of how it doesn't support it. So since you mentioned the Massey report, I was reflecting on that last night and what that created and the mission of that report at the time, right, which was in the 1950s, the idea of what does Canada look like to outsiders? How do we differentiate ourselves from Americans? How do we sort of solve the French-Canadian or French-English sort of divide we have in the country? these are not the issues that I am dealing with in a current arts organization. These are not my objectives. And so the funding is still running through this idea, which, you know, they will confess in many different critiques on this, is basically an elitist European way of bringing art out to the people, which is my trap in my world, obviously, of excellence, right? Whose idea of excellence? What is excellence? Through whose lens are we making that judgment? So when I get into what's coming available to me in how policy works, I'm sort of stuck in a place where I have grants and I have funding and I have encouragement to diversify who's in my office. We talked about the Belfry program, but what we run into is we have no skill set to make a space that really accommodates people who come from something other than what the mainstream norm sits at, right? Which is really white identifying people. White is not a race, but that word that we use. We do not have a lot of cultural diversity in opera, and we do not see it in the office. So to bring someone in and assume that they're just going to adapt to the culture in the office is obviously ridiculous and not fair. But we don't have inside of policy support to move staff or for board or for the system to start to adapt to what that new reality is. So I feel like there's this missing chunk for us, so that we're set up to fail in some ways. We bring in projects or we bring in people that we cannot look after and we can't treat in a respectful way because we don't really have time or resource, and it's not really built into our viewpoint. I would also say I've sat on a number of granting panels, and I appreciate that the policy now has moved to, they want to see a safe workplace document. They want to know you have a way to guarantee this safety. But a lot of what comes through in those grants come from rural organizations. So it's one thing to be in a larger center of British Columbia and have resources, but it's another to be Prince George or Smithers. There are small communities completely run by volunteers. And I will tell you, I read on one, it was very sweet, when asked for their policy, said, we are nice people and treat people well. And I say, I know. It's not what we are asking. But of course, I mean, this is a gap in policy. So we can say, we need this from you, but how are we supporting those organizations? And it is a mandate, obviously, for funding, that we don't just send all the money to Vancouver and Victoria just because we know how to create that document. So how do we support those people in those communities? So as we move along in this, I just feel like this is a hole that we haven't taken care of. The other thing I'm seeing is a wave in policy is we really want the people who are going to benefit from it to drive the funding request, which I love the idea. So that would mean, obviously, right, the Indigenous community would come to us and say, we would love to make an opera, which is not going to happen. So I'm looking at grant proposals that I can make part of my world, but it needs to be driven by another community for whom I don't have a relationship. I may not have relevance. I'm trying to find inventive ways to make the funding go, and it still needs to be powered by those people. So I would say I'm back to, I need time, money, funding policy to encourage relationship and make time for relationship, because I will say that's one of the biggest obstacles I keep finding in Western construct is we have an idea in Western construct that time, respectful use of time is I send you an email and you respond in a timely way. But I can tell you, having worked in my community, that if I send an email, no one is responding. And if I leave a voicemail, no one is responding. I really need to go and have tea. I really need to go and take a gift. And we need to have time to get to know each other. And that's not also built in, but somehow I'm supposed to have a project that's going to move forward. So whether I need more guidelines inside institutions or I need funding, like that's a real thing. It's still, we're living in a world of extraction, right? Where it's just a commerce of exchange, a commodity. It also assumes that we have the same on what is of value, right? That the outcome is the valuable thing instead of the relationship building would be the valuable thing. So these are ways that I just don't think we've begun to really think about what we're asking. We're not what we're really asking us to do with these policies. And what else will I throw into my meeting? I'm going to pass it on. So I'm
It's all good.
Yeah,
You said you're talking.
I think the issue with, with policy, and I think this is an education piece, is that one of the obstacles absolutely is that the people who've been in power for a very long time are very frightened to lose the thing they love. And they haven't been able to change their viewpoint to see the importance of arts as a shared resource, as a community way of connection, that we've lost track of what the arts is for and what our real purpose in society is. And we've been sort of stuck, and certainly in my world, in an aesthetic that now defines us. And now it seems like that's what we will lose if we have to do this. And to change the mindset of the people who run the companies, who come from a certain time period, from a certain background and a certain affluence, it's going to require some policy that helps facilitate, but it's going to require also the acknowledgement that there is, we talk about, there's unlearning, and it ends up being a personal journey, but if you're in a system, it's everyone's personal journey, and we all have to do it at the same time. So it's a big challenge, but I think that's the piece I really want to see so we can make shift. I'm not going to get into equitable cultural policy because I think my time is up. I'm going to
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks so much, Rebecca, and thanks, Taiwo and Denise, for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for making time today to be here. Such an important topic. When I saw the words equity and culture, I thought, okay, that's interesting. Equitable cultural policy. Now, what does that really mean? And well, let me start off by saying hello and Sat Sri Akal. My name is Jasmindra Jawanda. I was born on the unceded lands of the Wasanich peoples. Proud daughter of immigrant parents. Both my parents are from India. And I want to say happy Vaisakhi to everyone, which is for 6th around the world. We're celebrating springtime harvest today, and also the birth of the Khalsa, which is the beloved community that was created out of Sikhism. And that's what Khalsa means. So happy Vaisakhi to everyone out there in Zoom. And because actually it is fitting, it's about culture. And so that being said, again, being born here as a racialized woman, it's not easy to live in a conservative colonial city called Victoria. I was born and raised here, and then I left in my 20s, and I went away, a little bit international, a little bit local, and I came back about 9 years ago to take care of my elderly father, who just turned 99 years old, and my mom's 86. And so now that I've navigated back to where I was born, as an urban planner, I say out loud, I don't feel like I belong in the city that I was born into. Why is that? Well, my background happens to be South Asian. I don't see any visible representation of the South Asian community as of yet here on the unceded lands. I'm not the only one that was born and raised here that feels like this. As an urban planner, for me, it's critical that if someone wants to belong, what are we not doing? And what are we not doing right to make that person belong? So I'm coming in from an urban planning perspective, but I'm really these days not focusing on buildings. I used to be a land use planner, great to work in zoning, development permit areas, etc. But I really feel if we're building buildings, who are we actually building for? And it's for the people. So urban planners, they work so hard, land use planners in particular, they have so many applications on their desk. They may not have time to do that community cultural engagement to actually then come back and create a policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to interweave. I'm a little bit of a masala planner, so taking spices. So I'm going to be a little bit formal, a little bit informal. And so I'm going to be looking down a lot, but I want to make sure I can get some key points across from an urban and cultural planning perspective. So here we go. I got to put my glasses on. So really, culture, what is culture? How do we define culture? So I'm going to look at the UN, UNESCO, and I'm going to read out their definition of culture. So culture should be seen as, to quote, the set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of society or social group, and that it encompasses, in addition to art and literature, lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. So that's one definition. There's an Australian cultural planner, his name is John Hawkes. And in his words, he describes culture as, it's not a pile of artifacts. It is us, the living, breathing sum of us. And I felt that was a powerful definition because it is, as Taiwo was saying, that interconnectedness. It's that living, breathing sum of us. So that's some of the definitions of culture. So planning, yeah, land use planning, we all know about that. Bike lanes, social housing. We talk about social planning, which is very important. Community planning, absolutely. But what I want to talk about today is cultural planning. And we're not seeing enough of cultural planning in our local governments, in our municipalities. because it's been couched into these other domains. But cultural planning is absolutely a very important municipal planning tool because it allows us to build those equitable, inclusive communities. What is cultural planning? Well, it's been defined as a process of inclusive community consultation and decision-making that helps local government identify cultural resources and assets that can help a community to achieve its goals. It's a relatively new concept. It was only around in the 1960s and 70s in the urban planning world. And it came about because of the changing economies and demographics in cities across Canada. But a municipal cultural plan, and so it exists in certain municipalities, they actually have a municipal cultural plan. So it's guided by 5 core assumptions. I just want to go over them because it's really important to know what a municipal cultural plan is. So municipalities, 1, they're focusing on cultural resources and assets. So those include creative industries, cultural spaces and facilities, natural and cultural heritage, festivals and events, and community cultural organizations. So those are your cultural resources and assets in the community. Then we have something called cultural mapping, which I'd like to see more of, but we're not doing enough of this. So cultural mapping is a systemic approach to identifying and recording your cultural resources and assets by creating a visual map. So it's a very important tool as a cultural map. The third one is adopting a cultural lens. So municipalities are looking at how do they adopt a cultural lens vertically and horizontally across all municipal departments. The next one is creating cross-sectorial strategies. So that's another focus is municipalities want to go out to connect with community, to connect with business, to connect with academia. And then the last one that they're focusing on is networks and engagement, which Rebecca talked about as well. How do we do engagement really? What I want to say is that municipal cultural planning is a great benefit to local governments as it harnesses their cultural resources and creative potential to achieve those economic and social goals. It creates jobs, it brings people into cities. It's an investment. Why don't we invest in culture like we do in housing and we do in roads? So there has to be a rethink, a decolonization of the urban planning practice as well. Because we tend to focus culture as products. And that's the white Eurocentric gaze on this. And that's what we're trying to dismantle. So it really is a tool that often is missing from our local municipalities, which means artists and cultural creatives are actually going to be missing out too. So how do we create that bridge between artists and community with your local municipalities? And make sure there's a compassionate, respectful, mutually synergistic bridge where it's not just one way. And that's where we meet each other at the middle of the bridge. And this is really important for me because I'm not seeing enough of it as an urban planner. And so municipal cultural planning, it does have economic development component to it, absolutely. But I want to emphasize some more. Cultural investment plays a central role in urban revitalization. Cultural investment attracts businesses, visitors, and new residents. It increases the tax base. Cultural investment enhances the market appeal of an area. And cultural investment, of course, attracts tourism dollars. Now, the next key planning concept that I want to talk about is cultural mapping. And I've touched upon it, but cultural mapping is really your community cultural assessment. So how do you go out into the community and identify your cultural assets and cultural resources? Who is doing that collaborative process? Who's doing that community engagement? And so we talk about this, but assessments were really popular in the 1990s. I don't know, people in the 1990s, we were talking about cultural impact assessments. We were talking about environmental impact assessments. We were talking about social impact assessments. When I was doing my master's in the 90s at UBC as a planner, it was all about impact assessments because you have a project, but what is the impact of that project on that community? So we need to bring back CIA's cultural impact assessments into our municipalities. And I do want to talk about 2 kinds of cultural mapping, and you've heard of this, mapping tangible cultural resources, right? So we can see it, we can sense it, we can touch it. So these are your physical or tangible cultural resources, including community organizations, cultural enterprises, festivals, but really mapping intangible cultural resources is where we need to focus on now. And there's not enough funding, not enough attention. We want to explore and record the intangible cultural assets, the stories, the rituals, the being, the presence, the knowing, and the doing. That identity, that sense of place is so important. And municipalities have a key role to play in that to creating equitable cultural policy. I know I'm mindful of time, but I do want to talk about Saanich. I had some work in Saanich, and we have 13 municipalities in the CRD. Saanich is your largest municipality in terms of land base, and Saanich has the highest percentage of ethno-cultural peoples as well out of all of the 13 municipalities. So Saanich has an arts and cultural strategy. So it's important for artists here and cultural creatives to knock on your doors of your municipalities and ask them, what strategies do you have? And where do I fit in or don't fit in? I'm not going to go over all of the goals, but if you want to check them out, it's called the Saanich Arts and Culture Strategy. So they list off some very important goals, but I'm really mindful of the time. And now it brings me to the CRD. So the Capital Regional District is responsible for 13 municipalities, whether it's sewage, whether it's culture. So they have a department called the Arts and Culture Support Service. And so the CRD focuses on two areas. They have an arts committee and an arts advisory council. And the arts committee is where municipalities send one counselor to this committee. So out of the 13 municipalities, you'll have one counselor at this committee. And then they also have the Arts Advisory Council, which is an independent, community-based and arm's length body to provide advice to that committee. So for artists out there in Victoria, please also familiarize yourself with CRD as well, because they're responsible for funding as well across the board. One of the main roles and responsibilities of the CRD Arts Service is to act as a sub-regional service that provides funding to arts organizations on behalf of contributing municipalities. And I didn't know about this as a planner, but it was a few years ago when I was working with Saanich. It's interesting. They have a finance model in terms of the CRD. So you have these 13 municipalities, 7 municipalities, Saanich is one of them, Victoria, Esquimalt as well. They pool their money into the CRD. So for example, Saanich a few years ago was $1 million from Saanich residents that went into this pool of money. Some other municipalities who are not tied into this are just contributing money where they can, but there is an actual a finance model for municipalities around arts that's been created by the CRD. So I'm kind of talking about the formal structures behind the scenes. That's really important to know, kind of like that skeleton behind the body. So that was fascinating to find out that municipalities have these funding mechanisms, and they have a conversion model, which I'm not going to get into because it's technical. But the CRD, it's the center of all of our municipalities. We're funneling money into this area, which is great. My question is, as a Saanich resident, as well as where is that money going into Saanich? And that's a conversation we should all be having with the CRD and our own municipalities as artists and cultural creatives. Where is the money going? Am I seeing it in my backyard, my sidewalk, my front yard, in my own community? And now just quickly, a brief shout outs to a few municipalities that are doing great work. Am I okay for a few minutes? Yep. Thank you. City of Vancouver is just rocking it because they have the money, they have the resources, and they have really cool planners. So they just created, and I advise all of you, if you have time, please check out their Vancouver Culture Plan from 2020 to 2029. So a new plan, they called it Culture Shift. Blanketing the city in arts and culture. To quote, the aims to transform how arts and culture are integrated into every facet of our city and the city's decisions, and that shape it in ways that equitably reflect the city's diversity and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So again, you see that word equitably. The shift responds to an urgent necessity to act and the potential to position Vancouver as a global leader in cultural planning. So there's those two words again in this really big plan. They're mentioning cultural planning. So the city of Vancouver is doing it. City of New West is doing great work. They were the first municipality in Canada to formally acknowledge and apologize to the Chinese community for past practices which resulted in discrimination and exclusion. Other municipalities should be following suit. And they've also embarked on their first diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism framework. So a shout out to New West, because some municipalities aren't incorporating anti-racism into the EDI work, and New West is. City of Victoria has their own plan called Create Victoria. It won an award in 2018. And as well, it has an online cultural map. So those of you who don't know, there's an online cultural map out of the City of Victoria's website. City of Saanich, they've created a Saanich Leadership Council, and they've created a memorandum of understanding between council and the Wasanich Council. So this is really important. We're talking about equitable cultural policy and Indigenous lands. And again, as a planner, when we build on these lands, whose lands are we building on? So important to talk about land justice movement and the land back movement as well. And according to Sartlet First Nation Chief Don Tom, who's part of this new council, he says, the district of Saanich get their name from our people, and they make decisions about our lands and water without our participation. This MOU is a first step towards changing this relationship and creating a welcoming feeling for Wasanich people in our homelands. We look forward to the exciting and difficult conversations ahead, knowing that the district of Saanich is working in good faith toward our shared goals of reconciliation. So those are words by Chief Tom. Vancouver, Hogan's Alley Society, great work. Hogan's Alley, if you don't know, it was a lively Black area in Strathcona in Vancouver. And then in the 60s, the Georgia Viaduct was built and it devastated this thriving Black community. So now they have Hogan's Alley Society that is revitalizing it. Please check it out. They have a new housing development called Nora Hendricks. And Nora Hendricks was a pioneer in that community. She was also Jimi Hendrix's grandmother. So Jimi Hendrix, as a young boy, would visit Hogan's Alley. And so this is what Hogan's Alley is doing. They're revitalizing their Black and African community through equitable cultural policy with the city of Vancouver. The Victoria Chinese Museum, great shout out. Please visit it in Chinatown. So in 2020, the Victoria Chinatown Museum was formed to honor Chinese citizens and the community. It's dedicated to the creation of a permanent museum. So please check that one out. I also want to talk about Primary Colors. It's a multi-year arts initiative, which began in 2016. The founders are France Trepanier and Chris Creighton Kelly. And on their website, they say their main objective is to place Indigenous arts at the center of the Canadian art system. Primary Colors also asserts that creative practices by artists of color who have roots around the world play a critical role in imagining the future of Canadian art making. So I really feel it's important to highlight the promising practices and the best practices and amplifying the voices of others. Who's doing the great work out there? And this is how we learn. I come from a Black feminist space in the 1990s. Bell Hooks, Maya Angelou, Angela Davis, if you're familiar with their works, they created the term, we climb, as we climb, we lift each other up. So for the Indigenous, Black, and people of color community, so important, as each of us climbs up, let's lift each other up as well. Now, finally, I just want to talk about creative placemaking. It's a tool, again, a municipal cultural planning tool. So how do you make a place creative? So it's actually called creative placemaking. So again, our municipalities doing creative placemaking, some are, but most aren't. And I just want to say a few words about creative placemaking, and then I'm almost done. So thank you. Creative placemaking plays a critical role in decolonizing whiteness in public spaces by bringing IBPOC artists and communities together to create art that is rooted in community-based development, grassroots participation, and cultural democracy. What is cultural democracy? Well, it's a notion that everybody's heritage and cultural expression is worthwhile and deserving of an equitable share. So we see the word equitable again, an equitable share of whatever resources are available. That's cultural democracy. And when we create cultural democracy in public space with art by IBPOC artists and communities, this ultimately ignites a powerful sense of identity and invokes feelings of acceptance and belonging that is inseparable from their cultures. I had 2 slides, but I'm not able to show it today. One was Indigenous artist Carrie Newman's work, the Earth Drums at Cedar Hill Park. Please go and visit those drums. That's an example of what Saanich is doing to create equitable cultural policy by working with an Indigenous artist, setting it up in the public domain. So when you walk by this trail, you can actually touch and play these drums, right? And some of you have. And so I wanted, the slides missing, but please go there. And the other artist I want to do a shout out is Sandeep Johal. She's also my cousin. She's doing some fantastic murals in Vancouver on gender justice. And she's part of the Vancouver Mural Fest. And again, so the City of Vancouver is working with the Vancouver Mural Fest organization to make sure that IBPOC and BIPOC representation is there through their art murals. And I know Kenji also is highly aware of that, living and working in Vancouver. So this is creative placemaking, so important. And just finally, my deep concern as an urban and cultural planner right now is that we're focusing, yes, on equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. But my fear is cultural planning may be ousted out, or it may be couched in. So when I look at EDI work, which is the work that I do now, for me, it's a mountain. So the base of EDI for me is we have diversity at the base of the mountain, which means diverse peoples, which means the 2S LGBTQ2+ community, which means the disability community. That's diversity at the base of this mountain. Let's do needs assessments to make sure we look at all of these communities and identify their needs through impact assessment as well. Then, and only then, when we've done our due diligence in community, then let's talk about inclusion. We're doing it wrong right now because they're doing it simultaneously, horizontally. EDI work needs to be the mountain step by step. Then inclusion comes, and that's your plateau. So then you can look and see, well, Rebecca, do you feel like you belong? Kenji, do you feel like you belong? Okay. Lindsay, do you feel like you belong? So this is inclusion. Then let's have some conversations around, do we feel like we belong or do we not? Then and only then, let's go up to that mountain. And then there's equity. Do we have equity? Are we serving the individual needs of peoples? Are we serving the collective needs of communities? Then at the very top of that is justice. So for me, EDI work needs to be done very compassionately and with great sensitivity, not like this. Let's do it like this and let's take our time. And I'm going to end it off there. I'm just going to end off with a quote by Lee Miracle, Indigenous poet. Lee Miracle says, "Where do you begin telling someone their world is not the only one?" So thank you, Shukriya, everybody.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kenji Maeda. My pronouns are he, him. I was born and raised on the unceded territories of the Wiwe-Kai, Kuyaka First Nations, north of where we are today. My home base is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, colonially known as Vancouver. So grateful to be here. There's already been so much kind of thrown into the conversation that we're going to have, and some of the things that I'm going to just add into the space when it comes to cultural policy. And you know, I'm the executive director of the Greater Vancouver Professional Theatre Alliance. I'm the project director for SERA, which is the Sector Equity for Anti-Racism in the Arts, and I've worked with many organizations across the province as well in other capacities. When I think about cultural policy, I think of it on a very local level and even organizational level. Of course, there's the national pieces, there's the provincial and all that kind of stuff. And I think of often policy as practice or practice as policy. The fact is that when we think about equitable practices, there are so many organizations and so many individuals within the cultural sector that are doing amazing work. They know how to work with community, they know how to communicate effectively, they know how to get shit done, essentially. And the fact is that many of those folks don't actually have a policy. The policy is it's not in the document, it's within them and their practices. And we also see, and of course we've seen it over many years, and it's been heightened in recent years, organizations that have often, or larger institutions that have strict policies around creating safe spaces, ensuring people are taken care of. There's you know, financial policies around pay equity, all that kind of stuff. But then people leave because there's too much harm happening. People are being injured, harmed in emotional, physical, all these different ways. And the fact is, even though those policies exist, it doesn't actually reduce the chances of harm. What it does do is policies are a representation of what we want it to be. And it's an opportunity for organizations and entities that where change happens frequently when it comes to people, for there to be continuity of cultural practice. So when we think about this municipal cultural policies, those exist for many reasons and many great reasons, including that they're doing great work. It's guiding the work, the programs and services that they're offering. But also the reality is that we have elected officials that change frequently over time with different perspectives, different needs, different types of resources and influences as well. So those policies are there in order to ensure some level of framework to move forward the things that we value as a community. So I think about that as a big piece, and just the reality of policy versus practice. One of the projects we were working on at GVPTA was called the Fundamentals of Anti-Racism and Anti-Oppression program, which was intended to be like a learning research project. So what would it look like if all folks in the cultural sector had a baseline understanding of anti-racism and anti-oppression? Because the challenge is that organizations, again, with changing staff, changing board, is that the staff often are, not often, but not always, but what we see and hear are that sometimes staff are the ones that are driving the change to ensure that their organization is safe because they're on the ground, they're in the weeds. And then sometimes the board members or even one board member just doesn't understand what's being done, what the language is. And so what we were looking at as a project is like, okay, well, how can we get everybody to have a same conversation so that we're not repeating it every time a new board member comes in? And it's not to say that new board members shouldn't come in or there needs to be a certain level of, there's complications when it comes to board members and volunteers and the capacity level. So the way that we framed the idea was, what if we looked at practice, like safety, understanding practices, good governance, as much like occupational first aid? Because when you as an individual take an occupational first aid course, regardless of where you are, whether you're in your workplace or if you're at the park, you have a certain level of training and you have a certain level of responsibility to be a first responder. And so you have that training. The challenge within the cultural sector is that so many of us are project-to-project workers. So there are directors who work with one organization and moving to the next organization a month later. Again, we all know about the gig economy in the arts and culture sector because that's always what it's been. And so what if we take the responsibility from the organization to the people? It's actually the individual's responsibility to ensure that they are ensuring that the rooms that they occupy, the rooms that they are guests in, also take as much responsibility rather than the organization as an entity, because there's a disassociation that happens between, oh, the organization is going to take care of it. But what the fuck? I mean, it's the CEO, it's the ED, or it's the chair that's often responsible for it, but we should all be responsible for it. I did ask if I can swear, right? So, I mean, the reality is that, you know, when we go into, I've gone into many organizations talking about developing policies for creating safe spaces, or how do you bring more racialized folks into the organization, or folks who have living with a disability. And if they have nothing and they're oblivious, the first thing I actually literally say is, you know what, funnily enough, the first thing to think about is on a piece of paper, write down, don't be an asshole policy, and list off all the ways that not being an asshole looks like. What does it feel like and what does it look like? Because that's actually what it, if that was the document, I'm like, great, we're done, right? And so when I kind of thinking about all these pieces around the policy and the struggle that I find for myself and with folks that I talk to as well, is that the word policy is actually very ominous, right? If we think about government as the thing that holds policy. So I use words like practice or guidance or framework, right? As a method. So it actually allows people to feel like it's connected to something versus it's required to go through Robert's rules to have a motion to put it into practice within an organization or community. The other piece that I wanted to point out was that, for years and years and years, there were many policies around work at home, not working at home where you have to work in place. But when COVID hit, think about institutions like universities, where they immediately, because they had to, immediately said, okay, everybody has to work from home, everybody has to learn from home as well. But I know many people who in the university setting who said they've been advocating for working at home. And the fact is that who they talked to was it can't happen. There's no way it can happen. And the thing that moves to me policies forward is the collective need. And so far, we haven't seen the collective kind of drive to see cultural policy embedded within municipalities, or at least not across the board. When we were talking or mentioning, in terms of different communities across BC and the realities between Prince George or Vancouver or Victoria. And the fact is, when I was working with another organization, I had a chance to go to Haida Gwaii, and my role was to talk about partnerships with corporations or companies in order to build sponsorships. It was a great program. I loved doing it. But when I was going to Terrace, Haida Gwaii, Penticton, Vancouver Island, the realities in those communities are very, very different. The kind of relationships, the kind of conversations that happen there are very different. And I think that when we think about policy, when we think about practice, we need to start from the localized level, from the person to person. It's the relationship building that both of you have mentioned. Those things are central to the way that we operate and that we believe and we value. From there, policies actually need to be much more flexible as it goes up and up and up and it encompasses more and more people. If the policies from a national level are too rigid, that means the provincial level, municipal level, and community level are actually going to be hindered. And so I look at, I think policymaking as creating frameworks where it gives enough guidance for folks to understand the direction in which we want to go in. And I think about the two things that come to mind around this is around strategic planning. So oftentimes we look, organizations are looking at strategic plans as an output, right? So it's like, here are the outputs for the strategic plan because we need to build capacity. So we're going to hire 3 more people, or we need to have more money to have capacity, which, we need more money. So that means we need to do fundraising plan, which means that we need to have raise $10,000 in order to hire more people. And the whole outcome, if we focus on outcome instead, in the way that I view outcome versus output, is that outcome is more the intangible. It's the pieces about what is the outcome. Capacity building for organizations are actually about health and safety and wellness for the people inside the organization and those who are invited into it. And so if we focus on if we think about grant making, if we think about policy making as a, here's where we want to go in terms of the outcome is healthier, better suited people with more knowledge and more experience and more skills at the end, there are a lot of different ways that we can go about it. And if we think about like the project grants that you were talking about, Rebecca, right? Oftentimes we say, here are all the things that we're going to do. Here's what the festival is going to be. Here are all the programs, and I get it in terms of assessment for peer-based assessments, but the outcome is the most important. And so if we can make a structure of funding and policies that allow for flexibility in the middle, where we really focus on the outcome, and I know the grants are now looking at impact as a core of their grants applications, and that's great. But if we think about that, and if people are afraid to go to a funder and say, we've changed something in the middle, they're really afraid. to say we spent money on something else. And I think we need to be, as a society, as a community, need to be more open and honest about that middle part, that the application was actually a framework, not just the work plan. Especially now with all the changes that have happened with the last few years with COVID, but now also merging back into a place where folks are going back into a bit of a normalcy of 2019 and before. So those are just some key things that I wanted to share. There's a few other things, but I'm good. And I just love engaging in conversation. This is my favorite part, because I pick up new things and new ideas.
That's great.
So that's where I'll leave it.
Okay, wow, amazing. Well, first of all, a round of applause. A lot of content, and a lot of times when we're talking about issues of cultural policy, and I love policy analysts, but I also want to hear from artists, and it's really incredible. Well, maybe some of them. I'm hearing Kenji, and I'm thinking of MBA classes and strategic planning and all that, but none of them, I mean, they're artists, and none of them necessarily have like a policy background, but the kind of amazing stuff content that I'm hearing coming out here, I feel that particularly, British, oh, I made a mistake again yesterday, British Columbia Art Council, that's what I was looking for, sorry. British Columbia Art Council and CCA and all the rest. I think, listening to artists more, listening to community more, it's really going to help us to really forge, an interesting path. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Deeply appreciate that. When we did the first episode with Yvette and Sarah, we were looking at the national level, and what the three of you kind of brought us to today is to look at it at the provincial level, at the municipal level, and even at that level of organization. And I think that's really very critical in terms of how those pieces kind of all come together. And one of the questions I ask, and I want us to start with this, and those on Zoom, please type in your question. If there's any question here, please raise up your hand, we'll bring the microphone to you, and discussion starts now. One of the questions I left, that session asking is, and I think three of you started talking about it. What would a post-Massey cultural policy look like? Well, maybe I should rephrase. What would, now that we have CCA, we have what came out of Massey report as CCA and other kind of amazing stuff. What would a post-Massey look like for us in Canada? What would that look like in terms of, particularly in our cultural policy, whether at the national level, at the provincial level, at the municipal, at the local, whatever? What would it look like? What vision do you think an equitable cultural policy, what would that look like to you?
It's a great question. Taiwo.
It's loaded, I know, and I know, but let's get from it, because then maybe that can help us to start putting on all of those pieces, because I think you all presented interesting dynamics and perspectives here today.
I think for me, it has to be about, it's the power piece, right? So there's been a lot of talk about policy being made, and my question I keep writing down is, who's making the policy? Who's the person in the room, right? Which is sort of my equation is right with my board, right? Which is make up a certain kind of demographic. And this idea that we know what is best for these other people is the problem for me of the Massey report. Because the Massey report assumes that we all agree what Canadian identity is, and we all agree what excellence is, and that's not the case. And so I really think it's about changing who's at the table. And my favorite example will be First Peoples Cultural Council, which is here in British Columbia. I've sat on a number of those juries, and it is so fascinating to go through those, because I've sat on BC Arts Council juries, but to sit with other Indigenous people, to read through a proposal, different things come to the top and are valued in a different way than the metric in a normal jury process. So interestingly enough, the last time I did it, what became so obvious to me is that we gave incredibly high marks to things that gave back to community, because that's a cultural truth. right? So the idea that I want to be a pop star is not interesting to us. It doesn't matter what your resume is. It's like, what are you taking back to your community? How are you benefiting the people? And I began to see that's a shared value as an Indigenous community, like you need to give back. And so something we chatted about, and it's now part of the grant process, is you need to outline what you're giving back, because we were judging it that way anyway. So I think it's so interesting that we think we can funnel all these arts proposals through one sieve and then gather together jurors and get any sense of really changing the model when we're assuming that we're all on the same page. And I wonder if it isn't about beginning to pull particular communities into those spaces and letting them actually get to talk about what's of value to my community, right? Because they will know better than I do, sitting on the outside trying to judge what is good for you, which is sort of the traditional European model of let me share my fabulous art firm with you. Once you understand it, you will love it. So that's what I think.
Yeah, and I want to echo some similar sentiments. I think it's really, as you talked about earlier, who's the framer of our policies? Who's behind those doors? Where are they from? Is there an IBPOC, BIPOC representation? So yeah, so Massey, the word Massey too, right? Connotates, right? European. And so I'm of a similar mindset as Kenji and Rebecca. I really focus on community. So you have all these great Massey lectures, these reports, but have they done their participatory action research and grassroots democracy by going into these communities and talking to the beneficiaries of these so-called policies out of the Massey report or what have you? So again, who's behind the report? And where does the report get missed? Are they going to Haida Gwaii or these other communities? Because those are the spaces actually we need to focus on. So I think the federal government has a long way to go as well, and they need to decolonize within their own structure too.
Thank you. Kenji, I'm gonna twist that question for you a little bit. Because we, I don't want to get lost in the Massey report and all of that. You were talking about the idea of policy as practice and practice as policy. And I really find that interesting. The project we're doing, we talk about that all the time, is that how does practice inform? How does practice become the policy, right? And there's a question here that I think just wanted to connect to that are there examples of, this question is from Zoom, David V. What is calling, most successful art-driven cultural practice or policy, to use your word, or change in that, particularly within the post-pandemic? Are there ones that you've seen? I know that Jasmindra gave some, resources and examples of initiatives. But are there ones that you've seen that are examples of what you think are really, moving us forward in this direction of practice as policy and policy as practice?
Well, there isn't a single thing, but I think the practice that I've seen in terms of practice to policy is documenting what has worked in the last 3 years. If we think about and we actually have seen it in many organizations where they're actually having conversations with their staff around, okay, we're opening our doors now with more patrons, and what does it look like? What are you more comfortable with? How many days do you want to be in the office versus how many days do you need to be on site, depending on your role? And so I think in many ways, we've actually been experiencing practice as policy in the last few years. And it's really exciting to see that, especially those that are led by folks who are really listening. And I think that's the big thing. Not to say that the reason why leaders of organizations are not listening, like in the last few years, there's been a lot of ousting of leaders. But I think the listening part has been central to what people were looking for anyway.
So within that context, going back to my first question, what does that look like? Like a post Massey, what does it look like for you?
For me, the thing that came up, I'm a very visual person. I like to be on Miro and mapping out a whole bunch of stuff. I like mapping
Yeah.
things. And so what I imagine is that there are a number of community practices that are visually available, and then you see the intersections between those community of practices as you get further and further larger in scope in terms of geographic range. And then the larger piece is that we see all the intersections from a national level. What are the most common practices that are already in place versus going from the top level of like the Massey report is like, and then it goes down, it actually is being informed. So then it can be a living document, a living policy or living practice document that people can refer to and learn from as well. That would be my ideal situation, and kind of, again, visually, I like visuals.
Yeah.
With colors,
Talked about that as
beautiful
well.
colors.
That's right. Colors and songs.
Yes, yeah.
And Deniz, you can chime in at any time, please, if you have any question. I want to come back to Rebecca because it's really interesting that three of you, Rebecca, you kind of focus on this, organizational policy, particularly within, POV and the projects that you're doing. What do you see shifting? I mean, you come from an interesting, let's use the word interesting word of opera, compared to other performing arts, field and all that. What do you see shifting in terms of the policies that are supporting or not, or those that are not supporting? What do you see shift with? Because you talked about that policy shift, the wave in that organizational sense. What are those highlights that you think it's really shifting, or you think could or need to shift?
Could shift. I think it's sort of idealistic still at this point. I think that there is a shift coming to actually value relationship building and outcome, to use your word, right? And to think about impact. And I think the shift I'm seeing in terms of it coming from inside the organization to policymakers actually has to do with reporting out to funders. However, we're sort of saying to funders, we did what you wanted us to do. We're beginning to ask for a different metric. And I actually see that throughout North America. It's a conversation with the bodies in the United States as well. So can we measure things differently than we used to? And then we are sort of looking at for deeper impact with fewer people versus something driven by numbers. Right. So my example is always, we have a community dress rehearsal program, and we for years have taken great pride in reporting enormous numbers, like 7,000 children served, like the McDonald's. But what does that mean to 7,000 children, right? And the argument of but maybe it's to go into 1 or 2 schools and deliver an in-depth program and really impact those youth that actually changes what goes forward in the arts in our community. And so I think that is something I've seen grassroots level sort of conversation of wanting to actually change how we are evaluated through funders. So I think that's the way that policy is moving in a different direction. But it's a hard shift because we like the old measurement style, but I think that's something I've seen.
You need to talk to CADAC and tell them that the stats and that they're collecting is not actually. It means nothing. Sorry, for the folks who don't know CADAC is a repository for quant data and financial data. Like that's it for funders. And it's just like there's nothing inside that talks about impact or other kind of deeper meaning. That's who should be listening, right?
Come back to business models.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I want to come to the other side. I have a lot of questions, and I should have a lot of questions because though I'm a researcher, the idea is I know nothing. So
yeah.
I want to come to, if there's any question here, we've answered the question online, any question in the room, and we're still thinking about, I'm going to come back to here. So, okay. Jasmindra, you were kind of, if I miss anything, just let me know. I like this. You kind of focus on the municipal, and the local, particularly government. And a lot of the time when we hear the word policy, it's always about government making rules and regulations and all of that to guide some certain things, like for a certain already predetermined outcomes and all of that. But I'm also hearing, and I'm hearing you, highlighting really incredible work that is happening from your experience in Saanich, because you did, and some other spaces that you work, particularly maybe beyond Canada, and you and I we talked about this before. What are those things you think we need to start learning that can help us here?
That's one of my favorite questions, because thanks, Taiwo. I would love to see Canadians take the best practices from Cuba to Antigua, to Japan, to India. We need, as Canadians, to welcome all aspects of diversity, which comes from our roots. As a Canadian of color myself, my roots are in India. But I look in this room and everyone has roots as well. I think it comes down to, now I lost my train of thought. I got so excited about, yes, taking the best practices from the global south and bringing them to the local north around arts and culture. So for example, when I was in Cuba for my 50th, I said 50th, I wanted to be dancing in Havana with some friends. So I had the chance to go to Cuba. But what I loved about Cuba was they actually have areas designated in Havana just for arts and culture. And there's a calle neighborhood, I forgot the name now. It's right in Havana. It's about 2 blocks, 2-block radius. You walk in, it's so amazing. Public art everywhere. On the left-hand side are the Cuban artists, and mostly Cuban of color. And then on this side is where you can buy their merchandise. So you walk in, and I met this funky young Cuban artist, started to talk to him, looked at his artwork, and then we got into conversation. Why can't we do that here? If we're looking at arts and culture, why can't we have a neighborhood here in the CRD? We don't have that yet. So I look towards other countries. I had the chance to go to Lisbon, Taiwo. Lisbon is rocking it with graffiti, murals, provocative, revolutionary, decolonizing. So we need to bring graffiti and into our public spaces. So there's so much that we can learn from other countries that we're not right now. And that's going to greatly, I feel, the different ways of knowing, being, and doing from all over the world. And we can change the landscape, our cultural landscape, if we lessen racism as well, because why aren't we invited in? Well, let's talk about the white elephant in the room. Some of us aren't invited in because of the color of our skin. And so we have to address, as Kenji said, racism as well is there. So in order for us to change any cultural landscape or any landscape, we also have to talk about what people don't want to talk about at times. And so some of us are struggling, artists, policymakers, planners of color, because we want to make those changes, but we may not be invited in. So again, it goes to those doors of the municipalities and others to start inviting people in, and then that's how we can make change.
Without tokenizing, because we were talking about that before in the outside as well, right? Without it being tokenistic.
Yes.
And also being, I'm a big fan of cluster hiring and cluster kind of engagement. So that means that instead of a Japanese person or one Asian person, you actually engage multiple at the same time, so that there's no kind of implied or kind of feeling of needing to represent when you make committees, right? Think of higher, again, it's kind of balancing out between tokenism and not, but like if you have 2 people who use a wheelchair versus 1 person in a wheelchair, right? But not just because they're in the wheelchair, should they be in the room? So it's this kind of being honest and kind of being compassionate about what the purpose is.
I think this is part of your post-Massey question as well, which is when we start to talk about those other countries, it's about what's considered art, right? And this is actually a definition of we need different people who actually bring this.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're right.
Otherwise, we say graffiti. My mother's going to tell you it's an 82-year-old British woman that is not it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
Right.
the other piece of it.
Another question here, yes.
It's a question, but it's just a reflection kind of sitting here and the layer that you're talking about in terms of like learning from other global places in the world. But there's one thing that I would like to recognize is that Canadians have shifted due to the residential school survivors and reconciliation and the TRC and all of the calls to action. And so it doesn't happen overnight, but I just need to give recognition to that, because in terms of, reconciliation being problematic, is still opened the wound of many Canadians to think deeper and to reflect deeper and to integrate Indigenous ways of knowing and being and protocol and land acknowledgement. So it's hard to just sit here and think about all these global influences when we have our Indigenous population here in Canada that continues to strive to unite and strive to, reconcile in ways that work for all the various communities impacted by colonization. And so it's just really essential for me to acknowledge that work that has been done and alongside everything else that was acknowledged today, because that has impacted the ways in which that we think about our place as immigrants or refugees or guests in lands that are not of our own. And I've learned from the local nations here on the island, the Coast Salish, Nuu-chah-nulth, and Kwakwaka'wakw, how to be a good guest here. And that has influenced me even as an Indigenous person. So that's what I just have to say.
Thank you. There's something we say at the Center of Social Engagement Theater is that we're hoping that through what we're doing, that we're fostering a global thinking, acting locally and personally, because I think that it's in bringing all of that together. What's the place-based act? What does that look like? When I think that's what we're hitting on here. The fact that, yes, a lot of things are happening in Ireland. The research team, myself, Yvette, Deniz, and Luba and Fanon, we saw some amazing things are happening in other part of the world. Like in Ireland, they just instituted basic income, something. I'm trying to remember that, and I'm running blank on that now. And that's it's in Ireland, and that's a practice for somewhere else that we could pick that and then localize that and see what can that do for us. So thank you, Lindsay, for really bringing that to us to say that regardless of where things are happening across the world, that how can we bring all of those things, and then what does that mean for us here in Victoria, here in all the territories and all of that. Thank you for that, Lindsay. The question here again, I know that we have 7 more minutes. We want to respect our time.
There is a question in the chat.
Yes, thank you. So I think I have to admit, I don't think I asked David's question correctly. So I'm going to ask it. I'll read it for you the way he wanted me to ask it. Could you please share with us what you think would be a most successful artist-driven cultural policy or cultural policy change in this post-pandemic quote-unquote era? And anyone can go for that question. I'm happy to also read it again.
Can you read it again?
So could you please share with us what you think would be a most successful artist-driven cultural policy or cultural policy change in this quote-unquote post-pandemic era?
If this qualifies, there is something afoot in my world for artist-driven change, which is about really radically changing the power structure in theater spaces, which are traditionally there's a director, for us we have a conductor, that everything is sort of kept secret, cast arrives, the great details are revealed, and then you kind of become a vessel for those people. And there's a lot of discussion about the agency of the artist in those spaces. And I think that's post-pandemic because of how much shifted through pandemic, which includes the murder of George Floyd, right? That just shifted worlds, the Me Too movement, and this idea that the artist no longer has to be some sort of vessel pawn, but that everyone deserves more of a voice in the room. Why can't we know what it is ahead of time? Why don't we get a say about costume? Why don't we get a say about interpretation? Why are auditions run the way they are? Why do people sit in the dark at a panel and judge us? Like, what about any of this is healthy or reasonable or good treatment if we're all here to create art? So I think hierarchy is really in question for artists, and there's quite a lot of conversation and requests that I, as an artist who went through 30 years of being at the bottom of the heap, there's a lot coming into the office now before shows that we didn't used to see, which I think has to do with the change post-pandemic of an artist seizing, wanting to have power in the room.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I I just want to jump off of that as well, because I think, I don't know if it's a policy, but it's an empowerment thing, right? Because the fact is that some artists don't want to do all those things. They just want to be hired. They just, and that's okay. There are also administrators who just want to do the communications thing, or they just want to do finance, and that's okay. So it's the fact that that people feel so disempowered to even think and imagine that that could happen, and that there's no space for them to explore that. So I guess from a policy or practice level, it's looking at how are those spaces funded? Are those opportunities actually available to apply for from various levels of government or even foundations and you know, things like that. So that it's more of a community of practice of offering the spaces for people to do it within an organization, but also around where is the autonomy for them to do it parallel to the existing system.
There's also another question here. I know we have 3 more minutes now. Are you seeing examples of the non-profit in bracket arts and culture and for-profit in bracket creative industries collaborating to bring forward equitable cultural policies post-pandemic?
There can be more, definitely. There needs to be more bridging in that area.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. And are there specific examples? If we think that, are we seeing like this multi-sectorial collaboration?
No, so I just wanted to say, I really feel that regional hubs should be created for artists, and we're missing that. So we don't even have artists' residences here in the CRD. In Vancouver, there's Artists Lofts down at Commercial Street. So where can artists and cultural creatives actually have a space so they can actually talk and then actually create policy? Wouldn't it be great if we had a big warehouse and all of these different artists there, and then they come together and then they start crafting these art and cultural policies? So we can't even give space to our artists to breathe, to learn with each other. And thank you, Lindsay, for your point. Yeah, first and most, indigenizing, and exactly. And you know, it saddens me that it took 215 graves for the general public of Canada and white people to actually wake up to the fact that this has been going on for years. So how do we work together? Yeah, there's a lot of unlearning for myself, relearning, but let's create those collaborative hubs for artists and cultural creatives so we can respectfully delayer ourselves, but then we can actually move forward by having this conversation. Because here in the CRD, I don't think we have any space for artists to collectively come together. And that's critical. No space, no people, no thoughts, no creative expression. So that's where my mind tends to go to.
Can I add one thing to, so in terms of for-profit, not just about creative industries, it's that relationship, it's been siloed, both in terms of government ministerially, that we've been siloed into different areas. Even if we think about BC and the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture and Sport, I've advocated for years around a collective working group between just even tourism and arts, but they're in the same ministry and have not had traction. So I actually just put in an application to do it myself. To go into hubs and then bring in arts, tourism, and small business, because the starting is we need to have the conversations, and the conversations aren't happening. They're on an individual level, but just from a collective standpoint, we need to understand that we actually have common challenges and common strengths, and we just need to lean into that with the allies of arts and culture, with the allies of that understand diversity, right? And so we need to start with people and the relationships that we were talking about.
In Regina, we have recently there's a hall called Dark Hall, and there's Connexus. It's a credit union. And I think they have this amazing, huge building that's for think tank and all of that. I think there's a connection where Dark Hall and Connexus are connected. And so there is amazing, and that's part of the creative, of course, it's not, Connexus is not necessarily a creative industry, it's more of, business and credit union. But for me, I'm beginning to think it's really interesting for us to start thinking, what are those alignments? Because I'm also very careful when we start talking about, once we start talking about creative industries, business models, what drives those things, right? I mean, those are bigger conversation, but thank you for that question. Elena brought asked that.
And I think the same cultural policy covers them all, right? There's the value of arts and comes something that we need to think about under cultural policy if
That's
we're
right.
talking about creative industries and non-profit sector at the same time.
That's right.
Two different things drive them, but yet under the same cultural policy.
That's right. There's one more question here from Gabriel Shinar. He said, in what ways, and I want to acknowledge that we're 1 minute after, so please at this point, if you want to leave, please by all means, we have to be full of integrity because it's 2:30 we said. In what ways can we recognize and address the ways in which cultural equity intersect with other forms of social inequality, including race, gender, and class? I know that we've kind of talked about this, so maybe this might be my way of saying your final thoughts from Rebecca to Jasmindra to Kenji. If you want to weigh in on that question, or you have any other final thoughts you want to share with those on Zoom, and of course those in.
Read it to me one more time.
I'm very fast, sorry.
All right.
In what ways can we recognize and address the ways in which cultural equity intersect with other forms of social inequity, including race, gender, and class?
I think my final thought is going to come around to power sharing and relationship building. That's kind of at the core of it for me. It's such a huge shift. And there's many wonderful people embarking on this. This is a long haul go. Policy for me intersects to this because it is the money that will drive the choices that go forward for all of our not-for-profit groups. But I think it is going to be in the end very artist driven because we are the ones who are most invested in this change. It's our livelihood, it's our expression. My children are gender diverse, they're neurodivergent. So for me, it starts to become really that philosophy of the whole next generation that we need to give power over to. They need to be in the spaces. They don't have to earn their way. They don't need to have a resume to come. We need to remove a lot of barriers and actually have different conversations than we're having and take money. I love the fact that profit sort of came here at the end. I need money to kind of leave the picture because when we think about money, we are too fear driven to go to an old model and then nothing changes. So I kind of need money to go away and I need to have a very different group of people in a room having conversation to drive the change. So it's power sharing.
Thank you, Rebecca. Jasmindra, final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess because the word intersectionality was mentioned. So I think that's missing behind the policy-driven policies that we're seeing today. So it's a great question. Yeah, race, class, gender, and so on. And how do we bring all of that together? And then it really goes back to having not just tokenism, not just representation, the right representation in those rooms. And I think that's the barrier that we want to dismantle so we can actually see intersectional policies.
Kenji.
Simply, I think we need to have more difficult conversations and uncomfortable conversations with our neighbors.
Thank you. Well, I want to highlight that last question is asked by my grad student. So kudos to you for asking that top question. Thank you so much for being here today. We deeply appreciate it. Thank you to all our panels and thank you to those thank you to the Belfry and to Rep Canada and of course to Shock that funded this project, to Royal Roads and CSET and to all of you. Deeply appreciate it. And we're going to paste the video online and then we're happy to send all the information out. Thank you so much. And thank you to Keith and everyone in the booth. Deeply appreciate it. Thank you.